My name is Sabrina Spector, and I am the Associate Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council. This event was a collaboration of several local civic association groups. I'd like to take a moment to thank my colleagues for all of their efforts to make this program possible. The Civic Association Coalition was formed early this year to bring together various ethnic groups to share resources, needs, and most importantly, to encourage open dialogue. The Civic Association Coalition is currently comprised of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Southern New Jersey, Cherry Hill African American Civic Association, Asian Civic Association, Pakistan American Society of South Jersey, and Peace Island of South Jersey. The organization continues to grow and welcomes all civic groups in South Jersey to join its efforts. If your group is interested in joining, please email me at the address in the chat box. We have many things in common, and already we have been a great resource to each other. But what we do well is advocate for our communities and try our best to have our voices heard. By working collectively on our common goals, we are stronger together. Tonight's panel surely will help us understand better if our efforts are being fruitful and how we can improve our actions to change our society for the better. Congressman Andy Kim represents the 3rd Congressional District of New Jersey. As a member of the House, Congressman Kim serves on the House Armed Services Committee, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and the House Committee on Small Business. Congressman Kim has had more than 24 town halls and has helped constituents by resolving more than 4,300 issues with federal agencies. Chief Weldon Powell has 26 years of service with the state of New Jersey and 22 years as a law enforcement professional. During his service, Chief Powell has served on the Attorney General's shooting response team and the high-risk entry team. He maintains supervision of 200 detectives who conduct investigations into criminal activity throughout New Jersey. He's responsible for the oversight of officers-involved shootings and death in custody investigations. In addition to these duties, he is responsible for ensuring that law enforcement agencies comply with Attorney General directives and guidelines ranging from police professional standards to bias incident investigations standards. He actively participates in community events that provide education to the public about bias incident reporting and police community relations. Shira Goodman is the Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League's Philadelphia region. ADL is the first call when acts of anti-Semitism occur and continues to fight for all forms of hate. A global leader in exposing extremism, delivering anti-bias education, and fighting hate online, ADL's ultimate goal is a world in which no group or individual suffers from bias, discrimination, or hate. Before joining the ADL, Shira served as the Executive Director of Ceasefire PA, a statewide organization working to end the epidemic of gun violence in Pennsylvania and across the country. Shira is a sought-after speaker to groups to address the concerns of rising hate. Moderating tonight's event is Dr. Benjamin Dworkin, the founding director of the Rowan Institute for Public Policy and Citizenship at Rowan University. As one of New Jersey's most astute and widely quoted political analysts, he serves as a nonpartisan commentator on political developments for media in New Jersey and nationally. He has appeared on numerous networks and cable news shows and is frequently quoted by all of New Jersey's major newspapers and radio stations, as well as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Chicago Tribune, and the Los Angeles Times. Please welcome tonight's guest.
Thank you, Sabrina. I greatly appreciate it, and to all the groups that have so generously contributed to putting this all together, and especially to our 3 esteemed panelists. If one thing can be said about societal change over the last 30 years, let's say, it's that everything has gotten faster in the last 3 decades. We now have instant messaging, overnight delivery. No, not even overnight delivery. Now it's got to be same day. Wait, now it's got to be in the same hour. 24/7 news isn't fast enough. So we have a scrolling ticker tape along the bottom of our screens when we're watching the news to tell us something that's even more current than the person talking on the screen. Everything goes faster, 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 except, it would seem, for 3 things: getting pregnant and giving birth, mourning someone's death, and bringing about social change. These things continue to take time. And unfortunately, when it comes to social change, our topic for tonight, we usually don't feel that we have the time to wait. And with everything else going faster all around us, the slower pace of change, of social change, is disorienting and discouraging and all too often disabling. And that's why tonight's discussion, I think, is so important to assess where we are as a nation and as a community in New Jersey in the year following the murder of George Floyd. It is a difficult time to meet. For all of our shared hopes for a better America that would have hopefully emerged over the past year, acts of violence based on prejudice and bigotry, both acknowledged prejudice and bigotry and unacknowledged prejudice and bigotry, these things continue. And for too many people, these acts of hatred are on the rise. And so the fundamental questions that we want to try and get to tonight are these. In the years since the murder of George Floyd, has anything really changed in America? And if so, what? And what hasn't changed yet? Where do the continued expressions of hate come from? Why do we see the rise in these bias incidents? And finally, how does this get better, if not end? What can ordinary people, like those of us on this call who are concerned about their communities, what can we do to advocate for a more tolerant and peaceful New Jersey? So what I hope to do in our allotted time is to lead a discussion with our three panelists, focus on these three questions, and then we'll have some time at the end for some Q&A from the audience, which Sabrina will moderate and you can put into the chat. So Congressman Kim, let me start with you. Thank you for being here. We all experience the social protests. We have a collective consciousness raising over the past year following the George Floyd murder. Names like Breonna Taylor and others are now etched into the public's mind. So Congressman, the question here is, have these calls for justice, have these calls for social change in America actually changed anything in America?
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and thanks Sabrina and everyone else for pulling this together. And always a pleasure to be on here with my fellow panelists. So great to see the two of you. Look, the short answer, Ben, is yes. Our country has undoubtedly changed. It changed the moment that we, as a nation, witnessed the video of George Floyd's murder. I don't see how anyone can see that video and say that they are exactly the same person that they were before that video. You know, so undoubtedly we have changed. We are still changing, and so it's an effort in motion right now, but we don't know what the end result is. And I think that that's what gives us great anxiety, is the uncertainty of what that change will be. And so the idea is that, you know, we are not on some teleological path here where we're hitting some end result that we know is predestined. You know, we know that change is inevitable here, but it's amorphous at this point. What the social movements and what we're trying to do in Congress and elsewhere is to try to give form to that change, to try to push it in a certain direction. And that's so important. You know, what I'll say is that, yes, the social movement and the pressure and the efforts that so many millions of Americans have taken part in over the last year, it has had a huge impact. I've seen it in my daily work in terms of what it is that we face in Congress. And I think that that gets at sort of one of the most fundamental ways in which that social movement has pushed this forward, which is about agenda set. Agenda setting is incredibly important. We face so many different issues right now, and I can't tell you how many different issues and topics come across my eyes and my desk every single day. So you know, a huge part of politics and governance is about agenda setting and prioritization there. And no doubt that the social change movement and the efforts there since last year have affected that. And I think it gets at, Ben, sort of what you talked about in your opening here about how we're inundated with information on a constant level here. So the way I sort of describe is, in the world that we live in right now, information is not the scarce resource, it's attention. And attention is perhaps the most scarce and you know, difficult commodity to try to capture and shape. So what sets different social movements apart from each other and what allows for certain ones to have a better chance is for success is sustained attention. Is this a movement that is not only able to capture attention, but sustain it over a longer period of time. And I think the fact that we are having this conversation right now, over a year after George Floyd's murder, shows that there is sustained attention there. Now, there's obviously things that we can do to sustain it further, make it stronger, try to shape it in different ways, and we can go through that over the course of this discussion. But what I will just return to is say, yes, things have changed, our world has changed, we have changed since a year ago, but we are still in process and still trying to figure out where we land.
Thank you, Congressman. Chief Powell, what's your perspective on this big question? You know, over the past year, from your view, has America changed? And has it been for the better, or have things gotten worse over the past year?
Dr. Dworkin, thank you for hosting this event. I greet the distinguished panelists and thank all the public for joining us this evening. But the short answer to the question is yes, we've changed for the better. The public demand for change has resulted in law enforcement change. And, you know, we've seen significant changes over the past year for law enforcement. Just June 1st, the Attorney General issued a directive that all law enforcement uniform officers must have body-worn cameras. And not just issued the directive, there's funding to go along with that as well. We've also seen changes and we're reevaluating our use of force policies. We're placing more emphasis on de-escalation and force as a last resort. And then finally, we've seen a lot of change in the way we train and the way we approach our training. One of the things that we sort of emphasize now is dealing with people in mental distress and how to approach them, how to deal with them, so it doesn't result in a negative use of force. And then by the end of the year, we'll be rolling out what we call ABLE training, and that is active bystandership for law enforcement. And that is what to do in situations where you see a law enforcement officer engaged in misconduct, like you saw in the George Floyd situation. So we're not just sitting around or standing around. We know exactly what to do. And there's also a component in there that addresses identifying, helping fellow officers who are under too much stress, because a lot of these incidents occur when you see officers under a significant amount of stress. And then finally, you know, I do want to mention that the framework for change was prior to the social unrest and protests. So the framework was there. The protests and the social unrest accelerated the changes that we rolled out. But the framework was in place with excellence in policing, more accountability, a more robust reporting system for internal affairs complaints, tracking use of force. So yes, there has been positive change, and as a result of what happened with George Floyd, there are some positive things that have come out of it for law enforcement.
Chief Powell, let me just ask you to sort of clarify something, of perhaps give the audience a little bit better understanding. I mean, you work for the Attorney General of the state of New Jersey. Most citizens have absolutely zero interaction with that level of office, and that they're dealing with their local police departments. Can you talk about, when you say the body cameras and these kinds of the new training, does this really filter down, and how does it filter down to the local cop that we see in our neighborhood? Can you just sort of, who is the one who we often a citizen will most often interact with?
Sure, and let me start at again, by starting at the top, it does filter down into the most basic policing level. First, we start with the vision, what it is that we want our law enforcement officers to do or be, or how we want them to interact with the public. And the Attorney General, as the chief law enforcement officer of the state, dictates our responses in these situations and dictates different things that police departments must do. I had mentioned a little bit earlier about training in the way of dealing with people with mental illness, how we approach them. As a result of that training, I heard something the other day of an individual came to me and said my family member was in distress and got pulled over by the police. They were in the middle of a mental breakdown. Well, as a result of this training mandated by the Attorney General's office, the police officers who engaged with the individual were able to identify that. They saw the individual was in mental distress. Not only did they get the individual to family members and ultimately to care, they followed up the next week with the family to ensure that he was in care and he was responding to that treatment. Now, again, I can't say that would have happened 10 or 15 years ago, or even 5. So at the most basic level, we see how a result of that change.
Thank you for just sort of elaborating a little bit more. Ms. Goodman, the ADL is one of the oldest anti-hate groups in the United States. It has been a year of reckoning for so many of us. What's your take on America today? Are things different now than they were a year ago? And if so, in what way?
Well, thanks so much for the question. I'm glad to be here with everybody for the discussion. Things are different. I think people are thinking about things differently, or asking themselves questions differently, but it's also a cycle that we've seen again and again. When there's economic anxiety, political division, the stress caused by COVID and this strange pandemic and this isolation that we're now coming out of, when they're ignorant, when there's something unknown that's making them anxious, that's when the most base impulses can fester. And when you're isolated like this and you're talking to people online and not interacting, that's what happens. We've seen these cycles over and over again. That's why ADL works in schools and with community groups to try to interrupt those cycles of hate, to make sure they can't escalate. But I do think that we've seen things that can give us signs of hope. And I think the wheels of government often are slower than we would like to see. So I think you have to look at signs among the people that you interact with. My father, who's 82 and a Navy man, came out yesterday and told me he's reading Cased. And I was shocked that that's a book that he's reading, like as a book club. I didn't even know he was in a book club. It was my young son who first said we need to go to a protest after George Floyd was murdered. So looking at the people around you, what are they talking about? What are those conversations? And really listening, I think, does give us hope. But there is a lot of work to be done. And I'm worried that even as we're building these new connections and new coalitions, and like the groups that have come together tonight, there are people who seek to divide us. And so we have to strengthen those bonds, not only in times of crisis, but in good times. And some of the groups that ADL is working with now, especially in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, came out of relationships that had been forming long before COVID, because somebody had connected us as somebody who thought it would be good for our communities to work together. And because of those connections, when the surge in anti-Asian hate started rising, we had people we could connect with. We could give our resources, we could translate our resources, we could be there and bring together resources from the community to encourage people to report hate crimes, to report bias incidents. And so we have to do that work all the time, so that it's there and those relationships are there when we need them.
Ms. Goodman, I just want to ask a quick follow-up based on something you mentioned there. And you talked about in times of economic distress, uncertainty, political division. So that's when things get bad in terms of hatred. So if we are coming out of economic uncertainty, if we are coming out of this, it's not nearly as bad. Should that in and of itself sort of reduce the amount of hatred? I mean, will that in and of itself be a factor in as we move forward over the next year?
I hope so. The danger is that we don't just flip a switch. And over the last number of years, and as Detective Powell can tell you, and as our own data shows at the ADL, we have seen an increase in hate crimes and bias incidents. Haters have been emboldened. I don't think the numbers of haters have grown, but I think that people who have been emboldened to act and have felt empowered and safe to kind of act on those base impulses has intensified. And that is going to be a fight that we all need to be gearing up for.
Let me jump to the second segment of our discussion tonight. In the past year, the term systemic racism has become a mainstream term. More and more monuments that honored the American Confederacy have been brought down. Street names, building names have been changed, and even corporate America has stepped up and added its heft in a different way in these anti-hatred efforts. And yet, despite what many of us might consider as progress, we still see these continuing examples of hatred. Black Americans and other people of color continue to face ugly and sometimes horrific and tragic situations involving law enforcement. We've seen a rise in attacks on those in the Asian and Pacific Islander community. We've seen a rise in the attacks on those in the Jewish community. And across the globe, anti-Muslim hatred has reached, quote, epidemic proportions, according to the United Nations. And of course, we all see the hateful venom that continues to be spewed on various social media platforms. So the question I wanted to ask the panelists, and Ms. Goodman, let me just begin with you this time. The question I wanted to ask is why? Why is this happening? Why are these acts of prejudice and hatred and bigotry on the rise, especially here in New Jersey?
I mean, so our data shows that, you know, anti-Semitism occurs, the states, when we do our audit every year, the states where the highest incidents occurring are New York, New Jersey, California, Pennsylvania, Florida, and Massachusetts seem to shift positions every year. Those are not states where there are not Jews. Those are high population states of Jews. So people, unfortunately, are acting against their neighbors and their friends and their colleagues. It's not just totally people they don't know. And emboldening in our rhetoric, in what's happening online, that the hatred online has intensified. Most people will tell you, we do a survey, online hate has been steady. Many people experience hate and harassment online due to religion, due to sexual orientation, gender identity, race, however they've identified themselves. Somebody will comment. In the gaming community especially, hate is proliferating. And so, you know, we are also a society, and ADL is an organization that values freedom of speech. But freedom, just because you can say something doesn't mean you should. And there are ways to regulate speech online that don't violate the First Amendment. And we need to be cracking down on those companies and making sure that they are abiding by their own standards of conduct, and that the people on there have recourse when they have been subject to online hate and harassment. And, you know, anytime there's a new technology, we always find, you know, haters, pornographers, anybody, you know, will take advantage of it. So like Zoom has been amazing to keep people connected, to allow people to go to religious services, to allow our schools to operate. And we've had Zoom bombers who have put racist, anti-Semitic, anti-LGBT, horrific things to interrupt services, funerals even, political discussions. And so, you know, it's on us to speak out and to show strength and to stand up for ourselves and our neighbors and our friends, and to speak out against it. And really the best way to counter hate speech is anti-hate speech. And so we have to do that in the schools. We have to empower people to do it, and we have to do it on our own. And it's sometimes hard, and we want people to be safe when they do it, but we do need people not just to speak out for themselves, but to speak out for their neighbors and their friends.
Congressman Kim, let me just jump back to you. Again, what's your take here? Why is hatred rising in New Jersey and across the country?
Yeah, well, look, I think, you know, Shira really laid out some really important parts of this, and she and I have been talking about this for quite some time as well, just about the different manifestations of that. So let me throw out a few other things to kind of build on what she said. You know, what I would say is that I feel this growing sense of the sort of way I sort of describe it as kind of otherization that occurs, that's occurring as sort of simultaneous to the sort of the shrinking and the collapsing of sort of a sense of sharedness amongst us. And sort of the way I've kind of described it, I think Shira and others have heard me kind of use this phrase before, but I have gone as far as to say I feel like we have this crisis of empathy right now in our nation, where we are struggling to understand what it's like to see the world through someone else's eyes, what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes, and that sense of sharedness amongst us, that there's a humility there that we don't understand everything that someone else is going through. You know, I can draw upon my own experiences of discrimination as an Asian American to understand and empathize with people who are suffering from anti-Semitism or the Black community and the struggles that they're having. But I'd be honest, I don't know the full extent of what they're going through. But but I can have a place to kind of connect. And we're losing that sense of sharedness and that feeling there. And I see it in my daily work, for instance. I mean, I represent 750,000 people. There's no way that I can understand the totality of what everyone in my district is going through, but trying to utilize empathy as well as these connections in other ways gives me some platform to do so. But I can see how difficult it is and how, you know, there are limitations to what we can push forward. But you know, I do see a shrinking of that kind of effort. And as a result, you know, what kind of fills a lot of that space is that kind of otherization. And then, you know, for instance, with the Asian American community, it's this constant sense, you know, that people are making us feel like we're just constantly, you know, foreigners, no matter what, that I can never be 100% American. And this idea that I have a loyalty to another country, or that, you know, that I don't belong here, that kind of rhetoric, it's existed well before COVID, and sadly, it'll exist after COVID. You know, COVID certainly has, you know, kind of, you know, lit a greater fire upon that. But, you know, that is something, you know, when we talk about sort of a systemic aspect to it, you know, it's about digging in deeper, not just within our own nation's history, but within each and every one of us, to be able to check our own biases and our privileges, to understand how we are interacting with each other. And so that sense of systemic and structural racism and discrimination, you know, that is something much deeper, but it requires, you know, I always say, you know, a structural systemic problem requires a structural systemic solution. It is not something that will simply be solved by, you know, by removals of certain statues or books from curriculum or other things like that. It requires something much deeper for us to be able to confront.
Thank you. Chief Powell, your boss, New Jersey Attorney General Gurbir Grewal, has been a national leader in the efforts to improve relations between law enforcement and community groups. But again, hatred seems to be on the rise in New Jersey. That's what the data seems to show. So how do you account, from your perspective, where you said, how do you account for why we're seeing this rise? Why is all this happening?
Yeah, thanks, Doctor. And let me just go back to a more basic, not even more basic, it was something Shira said a little earlier, and that is, I account for it because whenever you get a pandemic, social unrest, you inevitably increase stress. And when you increase stress on people and fear, hate's not far behind. The hate comes along with it. Also in New Jersey, in the Congressman Kim alluded to this. He said the solution is a systemic and structured approach. And sometimes the toughest part of my job is talking about how we approach different things that are going on in society to be sort of the agent of change. And hate is one of them. We have a very structured approach to it because we have a very robust bias incident reporting system. So at the very basic level, we ask anybody who's subject to a bias incident to report it to the police, which comes to us. We look at every single bias incident. That in and of itself may facilitate a higher level of bias crimes that are prosecuted within the state and bias incidents that make the news. But again, just going back to it, we account for it because of the stress levels are extremely high. People are pointing fingers at one another. And again, in New Jersey, we want you to report those bias incidents because we want to meet hate at its most basic level. We want to meet it right where it is. So when it starts at name calling, that's exactly where we want to meet it at, so that we're not talking about an increase in bias incidents and bias crimes at some level. But I hope I answered your question. And if I didn't, I'll go back and I'll cover, you know, that aspect.
Well, I mean, again, it was sort of the, you made a similar point to what Ms. Goodman made, which was that these things get them to say things when they're under this kind of stress that the entire nation has gone through over the past year. But, you know, as also has been pointed out, right, this was rising even before. Yes. This was rising 3 years ago, before anybody knew what COVID was. And so while some things might be diminished or sort of, I won't say incentives, but perhaps instigators of public expressions of prejudice and bigotry and hatred
Mhm.
might be diminished as we return to something a little more normal. We still obviously have a systemic problem like the congressman has, or something that's been going on out there. And anybody else want to say anything about sort of like where does that come from? You know, if we had no COVID, why are these numbers, aside from really good reporting system that New Jersey has, why are these numbers rising?
I mean, I think, reporting is really important. The detective and I were talking about that earlier, and New Jersey has a great system. And so you do want to see real numbers because you want people to report. But I think that even without COVID, we have gotten just very divided in our country, whether that's rural, urban, white, black, Republican, Democrat, like we're always us, them. We're very competitive. Like we're built on this idea of winning. And when you create divisions like that, and you want to, and we set that up all the time, it makes it easy to then other people, and we have to be careful about that. We have to be careful about that competition, on the sports field or in academics or whatever it is, doesn't spill over into personal relationships, and that we're not othering competitors. We're using them to be better ourselves, to challenge ourselves, and that's good for everybody. And that we need to celebrate our differences and learn more and not be afraid of them. And I think those are just messages that have gotten lost, and we've allowed our political discourse as part of the problem. We've allowed it to foster that othering and to demonize the other, and that's never good. It's not good for Blacks, it's not good for Asians, it's not good for Jews, it's not good for anybody who is different in some way, to be othered and to allow the othering to be demonized. And we all know what happens when it's never just hatred against Jews. People just don't kind of just hate one group, right? And hate is hate, and that's why we all have to work against it together.
Let me jump to our final section before we open up for questions about what can we do about this. So it seems to me that one of the ironies of the social media age that we live in is that we are connected digitally in ways that we never expected, right? I'm suddenly find friends from elementary school on Facebook, and I'm connected to them. And yet at the same time, so many of us feel incredibly isolated in terms of our relationships with flesh and blood, other people. And the COVID-19 pandemic has made that dichotomy very clear. So we all have this each of us has a bit of technological power with cell phones, and yet so many of us believe that we can't make a difference because of the isolation. So that is perhaps the irony of all of this. And I wanted to ask about that. Chief Powell, let me go to you first this time. How does this hatred, the systemic hatred, the individual hatred, how does this end? I mean, what can a local person from South Jersey really do to help bring about a more positive social change?
First and foremost, it's something that you're doing tonight, and that is communication. We need to start talking to each other. So again, get a better understanding of each other and each other's culture. Secondly, if you are the victim of an incident, make sure it's reported, because this festers in the dark. This festers when there's no light brought to it. And the more attention that you bring to it of different incidents and different situations that happen, the better off that we are. Because again, people are counting on the fact that this has become acceptable, and it's not acceptable. We must make it not acceptable by reporting incidents and making sure that we address it at its most basic level. But again, what we're doing tonight is the first step, communication. We got to talk to each other. We got to start to communicate with one another. And we have to just not only communicate, but just understand each other's points of view and their culture.
Ms. Goodman, let me go to you next. Just from your perspective, what needs to be done? What this violence to end this?
I mean, I think people, need to speak out. I think what the chief just said is right. People feel ashamed when something happens to them. They want to not talk about it. That it emboldens the haters more, because you've further isolated people and divided them. So you need to get support if something's happened. And if you witness something or experience something and you can safely intervene and support the target or the victim, you should do that. If you can't safely intervene at the moment, you should help that victim get the help that they need. But I think people can do so much. And, last year during Pride Month, my husband, who is, cisgender white man, went to a Lowe's and was wearing a Love is Love shirt. And a young woman who worked there said, "Oh, are you gay?" And he said, "No, I'm not. But I think love is love." And she's like, "Oh my God, my dad never would have done that. My parents kicked me out." Like he, showed this person that he didn't know that he cared about her. And I think it really made a difference. And I think the way we carry ourselves in the world, the way we act in class or with our colleagues can make a difference. And if we're willing to have those connections, like you said, we feel so isolated now. And yet it's great to connect with people on Facebook, but pick up the phone, have a real conversation, go for a walk with somebody. Things are opening up and more people are getting vaccinated and it's safer. We need those connections. When we have those connections, we're stronger. We stand up for people, we feel supported, and we feel safe to be out there in the world being, good people and good neighbors.
Thank you. Congressman Kim, I know you have to leave in a few minutes, so I want to give you these sort of last few moments if you have to go to have the final word here, and then we'll get to the Q&A. But from your perspective, sir, what can local people do? What can they actually do to stop the hate? And more specifically for you, given your position, what can Congress do? What can local people do to make sure that Congress does it? What's your take on this?
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'll try to stick around as long as I can before I get pulled away. So if I can stick around for another question or two, I'll try. Well, look, I think Chief and Shira also kind of mentioned some of these, but I'll kind of double stamp them here. As I said, I've experienced some instances of discrimination and bias, and even some of the most recent ones. I'll be honest with you, like I'm never prepared for when it happens, and I always play it over and over again in my mind, wishing that I had said something different or acted in a different way. And I think many people who've experienced different forms of this know what I'm talking about. You can never get it right. It takes I feel like I know other folks in the communities that I've talked to, we need some training. And that's where Shira and others have come in and done so really well. This is not something that people are naturally prepared for. So even before, yes, I agree with Shira and the chief about reporting. That's a big part of it. I think, especially with, for instance, I've seen in the last couple of months with the Asian American community, a lot of them they're not used to reporting. They don't know who to call. They worry about retaliation. They worry about other things, so there's an element there where we need to clarify, what people should do after the fact. But there's also just a preparation for what to do if you experience it. And there's also trainings that we need to focus in on what to do if you are witnessing this, and both in terms of being a bystander and witnessing this, but also in terms of afterwards being an ally and how to be supportive of this. So, I think that that's something that all of us, no matter our skin color, our race, our gender, our sexuality, our religion, all of us should be trying to find ways to prepare ourselves better and to understand how to act if the event we experience or witness or see, and what to do afterwards. That's an element of it. I think about, my son. I've told this story about how my 5-year-old, he had an experience where a bigger kid kept calling him Chinese boy. And I, as a father, in the last couple of weeks and months, have had to talk to him about what it means to be Asian American. And that means both the things that we're proud of in our heritage, but also what that might bring as well in terms of experiences, negative experiences. And going through that, first of all, it was such a intense experience trying to figure out what this means. I never had that kind of talk from my parents. But it's also, was something that was important, where I talked to him not just about the hate that people that look like us experience, but about how to stand up against hate in all forms. And, starting to kind of teach him about some of the different experiences others are going through. I'm kind of just rushing at it right now because he's 5, but I think it's something that I recognize is so important for us to engage on is to talk as a family, especially to our kids. But that's not just for families of color or other types of communities or families. It's something deep. Say is to the point you said, it's so important that we take more tangible steps to show in government at all levels of government, not just at federal level, that we're being responsive and that we're engaging. And we are trying to do that on some levels, on a number of different issues. You mentioned the Justice and Policing Act, which is still languishing within Congress, and that's something that I hope we can try to make progress on. The Asian American, we had a COVID-19 hate crimes bill that recently passed and was signed into law that was partly towards supporting the Asian American community, but also just giving more resources to hate crimes writ large in our country. And look, that one passed the Senate 94-1. I'll be honest with you, a version of that bill couldn't even get a final vote in the Senate a year ago. So if you want to talk about what pressure and visibility and attention brings, trust me, things don't go 94-1 in the Senate right now just for no particular reason, based on what you've probably seen out there right now. So, that definitely is something that we need to push towards, because we got to show folks that there's progress to be made. Otherwise, I always worry about where things can go. I always say the opposite of democracy is apathy. And if people start to feel like, they marched and they protested and they rallied and they called, but then nothing happened, that's a recipe for growing apathy. And that's something we need to be very careful with, especially amongst our youth and our students right now, who are incredible leaders over the last year, mobilizing so many of the protests and the rallies that I went to and witnessed. We need to make sure that we are showing them that their voice matters and that something's coming out from that. Otherwise, I do worry that they may start to throw up their arms and just feel like, why even bother, which would be such a shame after, everything that we've gone through and been through. So those are some of the things that I think we certainly need to make progress on and move forward.
I think just 2 points of a reaction, sir. First, for those of us who have ever experienced an act of discrimination in any point, your notion of I go over it in my head over and over and over again. For me, it was a moment when I was 14, but to this day, I replay that particular moment, what I should have done, how I could have responded, and so I think that is something that perhaps I don't know if there's a way to train for that. I don't know if there's a way my parents could have prepared me for dealing with that. But anyway, I want to thank the congressman. Have you got a few more minutes? Are you?
Yeah, I got a few more minutes. I'll stick around for a little bit more because I'd love to see your question.
So then at this point, I want to turn it back to our host, Sabrina, because there might be some questions that we're going to be able to take from the audience.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your ideas and your opinions and giving me a little bit more hope. I'm really excited about some of the things you've had to say. I do want to stay, though, on the online hate that's been happening, and we've gotten lots of questions about that. We wanted to know, one question that came in is, what actions can Congress take within the confines of free speech to mitigate the amount of hate speech on Facebook and other platforms? And what other institutions should step up to address the increase in hate? So I know that this year we had ADL did a very successful campaign again on Facebook regarding Holocaust deniers, but what more can we do as individuals to stop the incredible rate of hate going on in the digital world, especially with our children?
I'll start on this one, and then Shira, maybe you can fill in any of the gaps. But this is something that we're tackling much more so and much more concertedly in Congress, and rightfully so. It's something that's important. There's an issue that's kind of come onto my radar. We've been talking about more and more, and I'm still learning about it, so I can't speak too comprehensively about it. But holding some of the social media platforms accountable for the algorithms, for instance, that they use. There's often been this argument that that these social media companies, that they're just merely platforms and that they're not liable or responsible for the content that's on it, that they are just merely the vessel. But that argument really crumbles when you look at how the algorithms that they are utilizing that are putting this in front of you. So they are not just passively the vehicle or the building in which this exists. Their tools are actually putting things in front of people and choosing. And as a result, there now is a greater argument to be made that they are in fact liable or responsible for the content. So that argument is now playing out into different questions about whether or not there should be any types of fixes or target changes when it comes to Section 230 in terms of liabilities and other aspects of that. So, this is still something that's kind of bumbling up, and we're having a much more intense conversation with it. So, I don't want to get into all of it right now, as I'm still getting a feel for it and trying to understand the different consequences. But it gives you at least a sense of how it is and what the contours of the challenges are. And as we try to navigate how to be able to manage this, as Shira has kind of mentioned previously, we want to be a country that stands firm and true to our founding principles. But we also need to find the ways to be able to think about how this new technology is complicating that arena across the board. Shira, I don't know if there's anything further you'd like to add.
Yeah, I think the legal and policy landscape is complicated, though we support some of the changes that Congressman was talking about. I think we also have a responsibility. So we have to use the tools that those platforms have given us to report hate online, to take a picture of it, to let them know, to ask them to have. One of the things during our Stop Hate for Profit campaign was to ask Facebook to have real people responding to complaints of hate and harassment, not just an algorithm or a bot, so that somebody could be looking at that. Because sometimes, Facebook will do things that don't make a lot of sense. I have a colleague who, was asked to put a famous movie quote in, and the word kill was in it, and she got banned from Facebook because she didn't have quotations around it. Yet white supremacist groups are advertising and on Facebook, right? People are advertising illegal gun sales on Facebook. So they have to hold themselves to their own standards, and we have to utilize the tools that they give and be clear about what's tolerable or not. When you see somebody post something that is offensive, you need to call it out too. If you don't feel comfortable doing it right on their page, send them a private message. We have tried to hold lots of people responsible, from a union leader who posted a really offensive anti-Asian meme at the beginning of COVID, to political parties that are using offensive Holocaust rhetoric to talk about COVID restrictions, to political candidates. And so we do that, but we can't see everything. You can send it to ADL, you can send it to the platforms, and we'll try and shine a light on it if there's a way to do that. But it's also kind of, we still also teach our kids about being media literate and being good internet citizens, as well as good neighbors in the offline world.
Can I just jump in, Chief Powell? I just wanted to ask: is there something we've been talking about the federal, Section 230 of, I think it's the Federal Communications Act, and is there something from the state level that deals? Is this really only a federal issue? Can the state deal with online hatred? Does the state deal with it? You're muted, sir. Wait, you're muted. I'm sorry. There you go.
For some reason, it wouldn't let me unmute. I guess that was my cue to shut up. But yeah, so we think that something is posted online and it's inciting violence, or it's a move towards some violent act, we get involved at this level. And we've had investigations where we've knocked on the door and asked that person, what exactly did you mean by kill this group, or the Holocaust this or that? So we have had situations where we do those investigations at the most basic level. and knock on that door and say, what did you mean by this post? Now, we do have to be careful. Again, it has to emanate from a report. So we're not necessarily just trolling Facebook and that's just an open page to see what people are posting, but we do get involved at that level. Now, again, a couple of years ago, I think the AG had asked social media to shut something down that was inciting, or looked like it was going to incite violence. But on our level, we want to see it. We want you to report it because, again, we're just not going to take it for granted because these are the individuals, if left unchecked, may move to further violence.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I've twice called the police in my current job and my former job about Twitter posts directed to me or my staff. I've called the non-emergency local number and I've had officers come right out. I've sent them the screenshots. I've told them, I've given them the information I have, explained why I'm concerned, and they've been followed up on. So if you are facing direct hate and harassment like that, you should definitely do that. It's taken very seriously, and I don't live in the chief's jurisdiction, but I can tell you that his colleagues take it seriously. And if it doesn't rise to the level that you feel unsafe, but you are harassed, you've got to report it to Facebook or Twitter. YouTube too. We found that if somebody looks up certain extremist videos, they get another one immediately. These algorithms, as the congressman said, can be very dangerous in the content that you're seeing or not seeing. And so there is some responsibility there, and hopefully Congress will figure out the right balance between how to regulate these new forums.
And just to be clear before we get to another question, but so that everybody who's watching this understands, if you are the victim of something or see something, the local police department non-emergency number that's your first step. Am I stating that correctly?
Yes, for New Jersey, definitely, because that enacts a system that reports that bias incident up to the Attorney General's office,
Okay.
and it's disseminated to all 21 county prosecutors' offices, as well as Homeland Security, because we also look for patterns in these situations as well.
Thank you. Just wanted to clarify so that the audience understood what to do.
Great. Thank you so much. Another question that came in is that last summer, the marches were for an advancement in civil rights. And more recently, the protests have been more of a hate cry. Do you feel or see the efforts promoting civil rights cooling down a year after George Floyd's murder? Or do you see them still as strong, pushing forward for advancement?
I'll just say that I certainly feel like it's still strong, and you see it kind of manifesting in different ways. Like right now, I see a lot of that same energy that I saw last summer in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. I see a lot of that same energy right now when it comes to voting rights, and when it comes to elements of our elections, our integrity, the system of democracy. I think a lot of that might be also further shaped by January 6th and sort of that being still very fresh on people's minds. So some of that kind of intersecting in that kind of way. So I still see a tremendous amount of energy. And look, I will tell you that you may not necessarily see it on the news every day. But I get a tremendous amount of engagement from constituents still about, the more directly like civil rights, law enforcement aspects of what we were talking through last summer. I'm still having a lot of conversations and discussions about that, especially as the legislation is still, still moving forward. Pass it out through the House. But still trying to get the Senate to engage as we are on a number of different things. So, I think, it's important that we don't judge that attention simply by what we see on the front pages. And this is something that I was always talking about as well when it came to the API side of things is, I want to make sure we can have the infrastructure, just have that sustained attention that I was talking about at the beginning, not just when something horrible has happened and it's on the front pages, or not just during the month of May, which is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We need to find ways to be able to sustain this kind of attention and engagement going forward.
Great. Well, we're wrapping up right now, and I know that you have given graciously of your time. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and I want to thank you also for reinforcing some of the very important messages that many of the civic groups are working on. And just, one, giving us hope and reminding us the importance of working together. And this event was exactly that example. And here in South Jersey, we're doing our best to bring together as many groups of people together so that we can have these open dialogues. And I think most important from this evening is the message for everyone to speak up. And when we see something that's wrong, that no matter who you're defending, no matter what group you're coming from, that we're all in this together. We all live in this one country. We all live in the same neighborhood, and we need to speak up and support one another, regardless of who you are. So thank you so much for reminding all of us. A year afterwards, the world has changed, but there is still hope, and we are in this for the good fight all the way through. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the sponsors and the panelists.
Thank you.